Hello, here's part 4 of the Origin of Eukaryotes lecture. So let's think a little more about what eukaryotes are, or more specifically, the taxonomy of the currently known diversity of the eukaryotes. Okay? So in the old days, we would talk about plants and fungi and animals. These are sort of the classic traditional groups of the eukaryotes. This is what you and I think about from day to day as eukaryotes. These are the things that are familiar to us that we see every day. And traditionally, these were called different kingdoms. So like the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom. Sometimes the fungi were in their own kingdom, sometimes they weren't, depending on the particular system that was in vogue at the time. And nowadays, we have pretty much gotten rid of the standard kingdoms in favor of these super kingdoms. Super kingdoms because they represent an even higher level of classification than the kingdoms. This discovery, that domain eukarya, can be subdivided into several large super kingdoms, is a pretty recent discovery that is not entirely due to genome and DNA sequencing, but has received a lot of recent support from DNA sequencing. Okay, and what we now think is that the plants belong to a larger group that include the plants, but also many of the green algae, and that both the fungi and the animals are actually pretty closely related cousins, which is a new, relatively new idea in the history of biology, that the fungi and animals should be considered close cousins within a group with a weird name called the opisthocons that includes some other types of organisms as well. And then in addition to the opisthocons that include the fungi and animals and the larger group of plants and relatives, there are all of these other weird names that represent superkingdoms that are all microbial, or almost entirely microbial. We'll talk about some exceptions. Okay, so all these other very large superkingdom groups of eukaryotes that are mostly represented by single-celled organisms. And that is one way of explaining why I keep saying that all three domains of life are mostly made up of microbes, right? So that is why bacteria is not a synonym for microbe. We have all these other eukaryotic superkingdoms of microbial eukaryotes. And all of these evolved from a common ancestor that had mitochondria, because all of the species in these groups have mitochondria. And the weirdos that don't have mitochondria are recently derived from ancestors that did have mitochondria. Therefore, ancestor of all eukaryotes must have had mitochondria. So here is the phylogeny of the eukaryotic superkingdoms that is in the textbook that we're using. The exact way that you draw this tree is currently up for heavy debate. The people who are working on the deep phylogeny and taxonomy of the eukaryotic supergroups are constantly revising their currently favorite tree and often disagree with each other. It's an area of active research. Okay, but things that we know about is that they all evolved from an ancestor with mitochondria. I just said the exact branching order, the way that you draw especially these early events in the diversification of the supergroups, is very much uncertain. So don't take this take this with a grain of salt. And that's also why it's drawn not very distinctly. So, for example, you see what are called these multitomies, where you have multiple branches coming from the same node, essentially. This is not really a proper phylogenetic tree, right? Because each node is not necessarily a single speciation event. That is done intentionally to indicate uncertainty in exactly what's going on in this part of the tree. Okay, you'll also notice that these branch lengths are all roughly similar lengths, meaning that a lot of the diversification of these supergroups must have occurred in a very short time span. And right now, we think that time span of this diversification of these different supergroups must have been right after the rate oxidation event. This, again, is up for debate and could change with new discoveries, but right now, the idea is that this explosion of eukaryotic supergroup, superkingdom diversity may have in fact been directly stimulated by the Great Oxidation Event itself, and that the acquisition of mitochondria created this explosion of eukaryotic diversity. Lots of stuff happened really quickly, and it happened so long ago, 2 to 1.5 billion years ago, that we don't know anymore exactly what happened. Or else we just need to discover a lot more weird microbial eukaryotes to make this tree better resolved. 2 different ways to say the same thing. And right now, the best evidence, especially because so many of these species are microbial, the best evidence we have for revising this tree comes from DNA and nowadays genome sequencing. And by discovering new microbial eukaryotes that might even represent new superkingdoms and new lineages within the superkingdoms that we know about. Okay, that was short and sweet. Just wanted to give a quick introduction to the eukaryotic superkingdoms, and in part 5, we'll tell a more detailed story about how many of them evolved.